but you've got to think about ways in which you're talking to, the ordinary guy. You're not arguing this to the United States Supreme Court every time. You're talking to Joe Sixpack, and you're trying to convince him or her why this policy position, this notion of everybody voting is a good thing.
Well, I loved the book, and I thought I would start with not an easy question, but I was struck when Obama left office, he supposedly spoke to some of his aides about that famous line, which I believe is in the book, about how the arc of history is long, but it bends towards truth, right? And he was saying that it's more complicated than that actually it zigs and it zags. Why do you think that's the case, right? Because science doesn't zig and zag. Culture doesn't really zig and zag in that way. Mathematics don't zig and zag. Why does justice seem to, you call it a march, an unfinished march. Why doesn't the march just continue? Why does it zig and zag like that?
Because the march, the movement towards justice, is a function of who we are as a people. And we are imperfect beings subject to a whole variety of different pressures, prejudices, fears. And it is all those things that keeps us either from getting to the place where we want to be, or when fighting against those concerns, propels us in ways that are consistent with our American ideals. And I think it's true that if you look overall, that the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice, but it only bends when people put their hands on that arc and pull it towards justice. And that's really kind of the point of the book. There are crises that we have faced in the past, and we've met those crises because people decided that they were going to commit themselves, sacrifice, put their lives on the line, and make this country better, protect this democracy. And I think we can do it. We can do it again.
That's an interesting point you made. One of my favorite passages in The Great Gatsby, he goes and he meets Mayor Wolfsheim, the organized criminal, the gangster. And Gatsby sort of whispers to Nick Carraway that this was the man that had fixed the 1919 World Series. And Nick Carraway says something like, I knew that had happened, but he said, it just struck me that it had happened as some sort of inexorable series of events, that it was that the idea that a singular person had been responsible for a thing that had affected the lives of so many people, it was inconceivable. And I think that kind of summarizes our attitude towards a lot of things, including the civil rights movement. The idea that John Lewis was a guy, or that Martin Luther King was a guy, or Diane Nash was a woman, and that these people sat down and, as you said, grabbed onto the moral arc and pulled it in a direction it wasn't going to go otherwise. It's kind of inconceivable to us today, which probably says something about the world that we live in.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't ever think I'd be talking about Arnold Rothstein in the same way that I'll be now talking about John Lewis and Martin Luther King and Diane Nash. But yeah, individuals can impact that arc, the direction of that arc. Individuals can impact history. And we have seen that over and over again. That's why in the book I focus on, individual stories of so-called ordinary Americans who end up doing fairly extraordinary things. Now, they don't do them by themselves. They have to come up with other people who will aid them in those efforts. But the reality is that, it's one individual, it's two individuals, it exponentially gets bigger. And before you know it, you go beyond a moment to a movement. And that's what I think we need to try to do with our nation today.
Yeah, right. I realize Arnold Rothstein is a strange character to drag into this, but I think, for every Lyndon Johnson, there was also a Senator Russell, right? We tend to also think it's only the good guys, but there is also the person who stands beside history and tries to stop it or bend it in the other direction.
Right. No, that's absolutely right. This is all about power. It's all about the acquisition and retention of power. And for every good guy that we can name and who is known to us in history, those are the people we tend to glorify. But for every Martin Luther King, yeah, there's a Richard Russell. For every person who was fighting for women's suffrage, there is going to be a person who we talk about him in the book who was against the right of women to vote. If you look at some of the founding fathers who fought against the notion that white men, I mean, think about this, white men without property should not have the right to vote, and were very vocal about why they didn't think that white guys who didn't have property shouldn't be allowed to vote. So their names are not as known to us as Jefferson, as as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, as Martin Luther King. But for every one of those, there is a counterpoint. There is somebody who they had to beat. There was somebody who they had to be, somebody they had to vanquish in order to be the successes that they became.
And that is something you talk a lot about in the book, and I'm glad you did, because I loved that book, The Women's Hour, about the passing of the amendment that gives women the right to vote. I think you assume, and again, we don't teach these things so explicitly in school, but I guess I just assumed that the suffragettes were battling indifference, right? They were against, well, women don't have the right to vote. Why do they need the right to vote? And they were fighting for a recognition of wanting this thing. And in fact, there was, as she points out in her book, and you point out in this book, there were people who were vehemently opposed to women having the right to vote. And a good chunk of those people were women, which is kind of the mind-blowing thing that as you really dig into it. So we often, again, assume that, that it's the battle against maybe indifference or not caring. And then if more people knew, they would care. But often these movements are fighting against real entrenched interests or opposition to the very idea or premise that the people are fighting for. And this is why it's not just enough to be right. You have to be good at arguing and fighting and politics.
Yeah, Ryan, and I think the point you make is a really good one. That that we don't know our history as well as we should, and that this notion of, well, it was indifference to women's rights. No, in fact, there was organized opposition to it. And given where the culture was at the time, substantial numbers of women thought, well, that would involve us in politics, and our primary function, or maybe our sole function, should be running the house, and things outside the house, that's for men to decide. And I think what we see throughout our history is not indifference to the ability of African Americans to vote, women to vote. At the beginning, white men without property to vote. It was active opposition to giving those groups the ability to vote, again, out of concern that this would lessen the power of those people who had it at the time. The status quo does all that it can to hold on to the power that it has. And that's what we're seeing now in this changing America. We see changing demographics. We see young people who I think are fundamentally wound in different ways. I look at my kids; they don't carry the same racial baggage, that my generation did. And so the people in the status quo now, the Mitch McConnells, the Republicans, they see this new multiracial America as a threat to their retention of power, and they're doing all that they can to try to make sure that they suppress the votes of these people, that they attack the electoral infrastructure of the nation, so that even when it comes to things like counting the votes, it will be done in a way that favors those who have power.
Epictetus said that philosophy wasn't this dry, abstract thing. It was a thing, he said, you should be talking about, writing down, reading about, exploring with other people all the time. He said, constantly have it at hand. That's how I think about philosophy. And it's weird. For the last 5 years, every single day, I've been writing this free email about Stoic philosophy. It's been not just cool to meet all these fellow practitioners of Stoic philosophy, but in writing about it, talking about it, reading it for our podcast, I have got to internalize these ideas in a way that I never would have been able to under any other circumstances. That's the idea. Philosophy is something we're supposed to engage in, not keep in these dusty old books or read once and be done with. It's a constant process. And I think that's why the email has worked so well for the people reading about it and sharing it and talking about it, all of that as well. So I'd love to have you join us on this email. You can sign up at dailystoic.com/daily email. It's totally free, no spam. You can unsubscribe whenever you want. I've basically given away a book for free every single year for 5 years, and I'm gonna keep on doing it until I drop dead. Check it out, dailystoic.com/daily email. So you must have an unusual perspective given the cases that you've been a part of on all sort of different sides. Like, to me, as just an ordinary citizen or a student of history, I sort of see these sort of two forces clashing with each other. You know, maybe one's the government and then one is a privately funded group, or it's a nonprofit, or it's some plaintiff. Um, what is again, to go back to the anti-suffragettes, like, what is drawing someone into the breach to be the person who says, no, I want to stop this from happening, no, I don't, I want less of this, I want more exclusion, etc. You actually being in the courtroom, speaking to them and their lawyers, what do you find about them as human beings? I imagine it's not usually the face of sort of irredeemable, unreachable evil. There's usually probably a logic or a story they're telling themselves, just like the women who oppose the right to vote. They're not like, we think women are dumb. They're telling themselves a story in which it actually makes logical sense that they wouldn't want this thing. What do you find about the human beings that are on the other side of these conflicts?
Yeah, I think it functions, right, on a bunch of levels of consciousness. There are some people who are irredeemably evil. But they are probably in the minority. There are other people who, as Lincoln said, you can fool some of the people all of the time, and there are those. The folks who continue to believe that the election was stolen from Donald Trump. There's probably a Venn diagram that shows a lot of them also believe that the moon landing, never occurred.
Sure.
And so you're not. But for others, there is this belief in myths that have been perpetuated, and that for whatever reason they buy into. Again, this notion, women, that we shouldn't be doing things outside the home. Our primary responsibility is the maintenance of the home and the raising of children, which is not, when you think about it, all right, I don't obviously don't agree with that, but there's a certain kind of twisted logic to it. What you can say is, oh yeah, if that's what you choose to do, that is to be the primary person to maintain the house and to raise the kids, you can also find time to go outside and vote. And they don't think that you can add on to whatever they think their role is. So yeah, and then people who have those views get exploited by people who are, if not evil, certainly opportunist, and are taking advantage of those people who are not thinking, who are not fully thinking, and enlist them and put them in their armies against positive change. And fear is a real driver. It is, all right, so if we give this other group power, boy, you don't, this is the impact it's going to have on your day-to-day life. These brown hordes are going to make your streets less safe. You see it in Birth of a Nation. You give black men the ability to political freedom. The next thing you know, they're going to be raping white women, and so they draw these connections in all kinds of strange ways. But the army that is against change has a variety of people in it, and they're motivated by a variety of different things.
Yeah, when I was talking to your co-writer, Sammy Koppelman, we were sort of talking about, it feels like when you look at history, specifically the history of America, just for to constrain the argument, there's kind of this like dark energy, right? The energy that first opposes abolition, the energy that opposes, let's say unionization, that opposes the right to vote for women, that opposes then desegregation, then the civil rights movement. It's weird how it's like they're fighting this rear guard movement where they're always finding a thing that they're like, well, it's got to stop here. I don't want this to happen, right? It's kind of this dark energy that's always resisting something. It's conservative in the small c sense, of like, I don't want this, I'm afraid of that. And it's just weird how this dark energy seems to, it never fully gets routed. It's never beaten. And you have the triumph of the civil rights movement, but it just works its way over here and over here and over here. And then, maybe even people told themselves that the success of the gay rights movement was the final triumph. And now we're sort of looking at, oh no, they've regrouped, and now we're having to relitigate that. How do you think about that energy? Like, what is the source of that? Is it fear? Is it control? Like, why? I just come back to this idea of why.
Yeah, I think it's all the things you just talked about. I think it's fear, it's control, it's people. We are like institutions. We like the familiar.
Yeah.
We're afraid of change. Our greatest leaders have taken us and told us about the change that we were about to confront. We embraced that change, and then we turned that change to our advantage, as a nation. That's why the 20th century was the American century. I mean, Roosevelt saw change and saw the possibility of change, didn't run from it, wasn't a conservative to try to maintain the status quo. Said, all right, let's embrace this change. Let's remake our economic system, and we will be a better people for it. But boy, that analogy that you use about dark energy, I think, or dark energy, dark matter, that I think it is that kind of unseen thing in the universe that has an impact on the path of planets, of stars. I mean, a whole variety of things that we don't totally understand, and nevertheless, it's there, and it has an impact on the universe. And in some ways, I can attempt to explain why people act the way they do. From my perspective, a negative anti-progress way. When in fact, the reality is this progress will probably benefit them, as well. And yet,
Sure.
they resist. And so that, maybe it's going to take another century to understand dark matter and to understand what motivates people to do things that at the end of the day might be against, their self-interest. I mean, I think you look at Joe Manchin and voting against things that would be of great assistance to the people in his state. Now, he's probably not going to suffer any negative political consequence because of that, because people there are not necessarily in favor of things that were contained in bills that would have made their lives on a day-to-day basis better, but they were against them for dark matter reasons. I can't totally explain it, but it nevertheless is there, and we have to recognize that it's there and plan our actions accordingly.
What's remarkable about Martin Luther King and Lyndon Johnson is sort of from two very different ends of the spectrum and different sets of experiences, they both managed to effectively communicate why the changes they were seeking needed to happen, right? And one was very good at activating people. The other was very good at activating Congress or political figures to act. And you sort of need both of those. Kennedy being an interesting figure in the middle that was pretty good at both, but not sufficient at either, you might argue. Do you think that part of it is that we do a bad job communicating about these things? Like, if you would one criticism of liberals in office today would be on those bills, for instance, that Manchin votes against, is that they've packaged a whole bunch of things together, and it allows him to find opportunities to throw the sort of baby out with the bathwater. Is it a matter of political strategy and communication? Is it that the people's will is not fully there? Like, what do you think has stalled the march? Can you totally blame it on the resistors, or is it something else?
No, I don't think you can blame it totally on the resistors. I think you can primarily blame it on the resistors. But there's a whole variety of things that those of us on the progressive side have not done necessarily well. Messaging. We have not come up with great messengers or with great messages, and we have that capacity. When you think about Hollywood, it's a largely liberal, progressive place. Let's tap into them and come up with ways in which we tell our stories better. I was watching, the January 6th presentation, that initial presentation where they were putting on that slideshow. And I thought, boy, that was done extremely well. And I was thinking to myself, I bet, if I asked Steven Spielberg to give me the best cinematographer, film artist, I could make that even better. Which is not to say it wasn't good, but I bet I could make it even better, and I could apply that, in other places. So messaging, there are problems there. We had a moment in time when in the 60s with those two significant people, Johnson, the insider, King, the man of the streets, who came together and brought about change the likes of which this country had not seen since the Civil War. I don't, I'm not sure that we can hope for that kind of moment again. The hope that I have is that we can get significant numbers of just regular people. King and Johnson were not regular people; those were extraordinary individuals.
Sure.
But I think we can get sufficient numbers of regular people to do extraordinary things and have the necessary impact.
Well, isn't that something that King said, that one of the amazing things about nonviolence is that when an ordinary person commits to it, it makes them extraordinary, right? And so, like those movements, like when I read David Halberstram's book, The Children, recently, and it was like it was just a collection of relatively ordinary college students. I mean, it was remarkable to be an African American college student in the 1950s and 60s. So I don't mean to undermine their accomplishments, but they were ordinary people who decided to, again, as we were saying earlier, sort of grab the arc of history and became extraordinary in the process of getting involved in trying to do something about it.
Yeah, you see, there is within us, ordinary Americans, the capacity for extraordinary things. I think about my late sister-in-law, Vivian Malone. Grew up in the segregated South in Mobile, Alabama, and she was one of the two Black students who integrated the University of Alabama. Wow. With Nick Katzenbach, at her side, Robert Kennedy, planning the strategy. She becomes the first African American to graduate from the University of Alabama. Now, I knew Vivian, until she died. Married her sister. I mean, and she was a great person. Would I consider her to be an extraordinary person? I mean, yeah, she was extraordinary certainly for what she did, but she was just a down-home, good woman from Mobile, Alabama, who did that, extraordinary thing. And we have within ourselves, I think about one of the young women we talk about in the book, Love Caesar. A college student at North Carolina A&T, largest historically Black college and university in the country, that was gerrymandered by the Republicans in North Carolina. And she took a piece of chalk and drew a line right down the middle of the campus to demonstrate to the kids there, if you live on this side of the line, you're in Congressional District 6. On this side, you're in Congressional District 5. It dilutes our political power. She mobilized, the kids on that campus, that historically Black campus, got in touch with us at the NDRC, the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. We brought a lawsuit, and they changed. They had to change all of the district lines in North Carolina because that one student, Love Caesar, and a piece of chalk did something extraordinary. Now, yes, that was an extraordinary feat. I've gotten to know her, and I expect great things from her. But, she was, by a whole bunch of measures, an ordinary person with that extraordinary capacity that she ultimately decided to tap into.
Yeah, well, and what I think when you tell that story, and it's a great one in the book, is like, that is the power of clear and effective communication also.
Exactly.
Right? Exactly. It's so stark and it's so powerful and it's so simple. And I contrast that, the pandemic being a great example of just preposterously bad communication throughout. You have your graph from the CDC with 60 boxes and you don't know. And you're like, people are busy. They want to care, but you're not making it easy for them to care, or they care, but they don't understand and they can't effectively communicate what they're being told to other people. What's that the chalk is so stark and so clear, and it makes the point in such a way that a person cannot look away from it or deny its implications.
Yeah, and it's that communication component is extremely important. Kennedy's greatness, cut short, was, I think, largely a function of his verbal skills. The eloquence that you saw in that inaugural address and other speeches that he gave, fireside chats, by Roosevelt. I mean, we don't understand the impact now in our much more fractured media landscape, the power of those when people would run to the radios to hear the president talk about and explain. I mean, that
He
first
was like,
one,
"Get your map out. I'm going to show you what
right?
Europe looks like."
Exactly. Or when he's explaining the economic system, and why he's closing the banks. I mean, these are, finding ways to do those kinds of things in the 21st century when there's going to be, at least, on the other side, on Newsmax, Fox, who are going to be saying exactly the opposite, and it's not necessarily going to be, fact or reality based. It is more difficult, but it's not impossible. And I think that too often we forget the power of the word, or the power of communication, or the need for communication, in addition to having good policies. That's, you got to have the good policies. That's the foundation. But how do you sell those policies? How do you make people care about those policies? I think, again, that's one of the reasons why Barack was, so successful. I mean, that speech for John Kerry, which is the thing that, ignited his his presidential political career. And then throughout his term in office, he met the moment with eloquence and with clarity.
Well, I think the pandemic and the last couple of years have also illustrated this probably timeless thing, but certainly heightened in our modern age, which is if you have a group of people who are motivated by something irrational or fear-based or emotional, whether it's the denial of vaccines or masks, or it's some sort of fear-based hatred of immigration or a minority group, that group is going to be profoundly motivated and driven and not bound by the constraints of reality as they seek to communicate what they feel and think, right? And it's like they're super spreaders of ideas because it's extra potent. And it's like they have a heavy dose of whatever it is that they have. Whereas the ordinary person walking down a college campus goes, yeah, redistricting is unfair. I don't really like it. But they're not, they don't feel like they're in the middle of a race war or something, right? And so it's kind of this inherently mismatched fight where the other side is seething with a kind of intensity and clarity. It's a confusing clarity, but a clarity about their purpose because it's coming from a deeper place.
I mean, fear and hate are powerful, powerful, powerful things, and they are difficult to defeat. They can be defeated, and it requires hope, it requires commitment, it requires idealism, it requires organization. It's hard. Fear and hate can be expressed simply. You need to be afraid of black people. They're gonna kill you. You should be Hitler. You should be afraid of Jews. They've exploited you. I mean, full stop. That's it. And so, you've got to fight what it is that they are saying in ways that are understandable. There are nuances, that too often I think we get hung up in, and coming up with those strong messages. I mean, I don't know if Democrats would simply say, we're on your side. Maybe that's a phrase. We're on your side, and then you build out from that. But the point you make is a really important one. That notion of fear, that notion of hate, and the exploitation of those emotions are real triggers for people. I mean, I'm not a doctor, but there's this part of the brain, I don't know, that motivates the flight mechanism and all of that stuff. I mean, that's what it taps into. It gets us at some basic level. Like you're telling me that I'm going to be at risk because of these people, this policy, and it takes a lot to overcome that basic thing that we have of self-preservation, because that's kind of what they're almost tapping into. You're putting your life, the life of those near and dear to you, the systems that are near and dear to you at risk, and you are personally going to be harmed.
And so from a legal basis, it's probably interesting because on one hand you're having to argue the law, but you're also having to make this appeal to public opinion as well, to the hearts and minds and consciences of people. How do you think about that? Because yeah, you can't go, well, it's more complicated than that. Let me tell you all the legal reasons that's incorrect or whatever, right? You also have to sell this sort of competing vision. You can't just say, hey, that's unjust. You have to sell why voting rights are better for everyone, right? It seems sad. It's a sad state of affairs, of course, that you have to argue this fundamental premise of what America is, that it's better when more people have the right to vote. But it feels like when you have one of the sides sort of either deliberately or covertly chipping away at the foundations of certain people having the right to vote or trying to mitigate or minimize the effects of those votes, you have to sort of fight that on a case-by-case legal basis, but you also have to make this compelling, like an FDR, a Kennedy, or a Martin Luther King cause for why voting rights matter to people.
Yeah, you do. And you have to explain to people why the nation's better, why they are better. Yeah, you need to appeal to people's, higher angels. I mean, again, we talk about messaging, and we tend to forget that 2008 campaign of Barack Obama. Simple: hope and change. Iconic poster says hope or just says change on it. And Sarah Palin made fun of how's your hopey changey guy doing now? Yeah, but that really drew to his cause countless numbers of Americans, Black Americans, white Americans, young people. The Obama coalition is really kind of the future of America, and why he was so feared, and why, as we say in the book, there was that backlash. But and so coming up with ways in which you explain the need for hope, the need for change, how it is going to be beneficial. You've got to explain it, but you've got to think about ways in which you're talking to the ordinary guy. You're not arguing this to the United States Supreme Court every time. You're talking to Joe Sixpack, and you're trying to convince him or her why this policy position, this notion of everybody voting, is a good thing. But you should not. This is something that's important. You should not think that these judges and justices live in a monastery. They're impacted as well by that messaging, and they won't say it, but they're reading the newspapers, they're looking online and seeing kind of where America is, and that at some level has an impact on the decisions that they render as well.
Yeah, one of my favorite headlines, this was in like 2017. I think it was in the Huffington Post, but put the outlet aside. But the headline was, I don't know how to explain to you that you should care about other people. Right. And that seems like the fundamental divide that we're struggling with politically and culturally. And you could even argue globally, right? As we always have, but particularly now, it seems people struggle with the idea that other people's rights or obligations or the way that they're treated, that it should matter to you at all. Right. I feel like some people get that. And then it seems like we are in the same battle. If we go back to the idea of dark energy, we're still in this battle to try to get people to understand that you should care about what happens to some guy running down the street who gets gunned down by like hillbillies because he looks suspicious, or that you should care about whether this district in this county, in this state that you don't live in, has been gerrymandered to such a degree that it's undermines people's right to decide who represents them. You should care about that, but people, I think, struggle with that idea.
Yeah, that's the tension in America. This notion that we are a nation that values, tries to enhance the individual, as opposed to a nation that cares about the community. And people see that as those being in tension. That I should care only about what affects me, the individual, and that's right. It's my Second Amendment right to possess a gun. It's my right. The Heller decision, by the way, is wrongly decided, but let's leave that alone. Yeah, it's that's my individual right, regardless of what the impact of the exercise of that individual right, as defined wrongly by the Supreme Court, will have on the larger community. And so that struggle between individual rights and community obligations or community rights is one that we wrestle with and have wrestled with almost since the beginning of the republic. And it manifests itself, I think, maybe most acutely when it comes to who we decide will have the right to vote, because then you're giving up. That's the way in which people decide the direction of the nation. And I don't necessarily, if I'm a defender of the status quo, I don't want to necessarily hand out power cards, to these other people who might decide that they want to do things in a way different than I do, that might have a negative impact on what I perceive to be, my individual rights.
Yeah, that's why I live in Texas. And one of the things I say, the best part about Texas is you can do whatever you want. The problem with Texas is that other people can do whatever they want. And it's this constant tension between, man, I really don't like what my neighbor is doing. Right. It's driving me nuts. But that's what a democracy is supposed to be, or that's what a country that protects individual rights is supposed to allow to happen.
Well, yeah, to a degree. But, individual rights, should be exalted. And, we favor the individual at the end of the day over the interests of the state. And yet, there are individual rights that, if simply seen as, uncabined, can take us to really negative places. And guns, I think, is maybe chief among them. I think the interpretation of the Second Amendment is all wrong. But if you just buy into the notion that it is, in fact, an individual right, and therefore a constitutionally protected individual right, and therefore little or no regulation is possible, well, we have seen, and we have seen on a day-to-day basis, there have been more mass shootings now this year than there have been days in the year. And how can we not, as a nation, react to that and say, yeah, all right, even if I say it's an individual right, I don't agree with you, but I'm going to, for purpose of this argument, I'm going to concede that. But that individual right can be restrained, restricted, regulated in such a way that you still enjoy the ability to have that individual right while protecting the interests of the larger community. They're not necessarily in tension, except that people on the extremes, certainly on the extremes of the individual rights side, don't want any kind of regulation, whether it's environmental regulation, gun regulation, a whole range of things that they don't want to have regulated, even when it means that, your electricity grid in Texas is going to fail. They don't want to be part of the larger, grid in the United States. We just want a Texas kind of thing, even though it doesn't damn work.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. I'm a gun owner. I live in a rural part of the country. I hunt. I have to have them because there's like wild dogs that terrorize, right, where I live. It's a reality of the life that I happen to live in. But to go back to the idea of one of those things that Roosevelt so eloquently expressed. We not only have all our constitutional rights, but he defines those 4 freedoms that we're entitled to as right, individual citizens. And a freedom from fear is a huge part of something we're entitled to as Americans. I think about that. I have this small bookstore here in Texas, and people go, "Oh, it must be so great to live in a place that's pro-business," right? Mm-hmm. And there is aspects that are nice about the extra rights that I have that maybe I wouldn't have living in California. But is it really pro-business when your government fails to keep up the electrical grid and you have to close business, or so mismanages the pandemic that all your employees get sick and you have to close, right? So I think that when you think about the individual and the individual's rights at the expense of the impact on the collective, not only are you being selfish and callous, but you are ultimately, the long way around, threatening your own freedoms. Like now, the same person that, thinks so much about guns now has to think about, as they drop their kid off to school, what could happen. And is that freedom? I don't think so. That's insane.
Right. Yeah, no. I mean, in our founding documents talk about the notion of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, that doesn't just apply. We're in the gun phase, not just to gun owners, but also I have the right as an American citizen to life. That is something that the founding documents say that I am entitled to, and this unregulated, this free for all that we have with regard to guns is a direct threat. And I mean, this can be empirically shown. It's a direct threat to the lives of the American citizenry, and therefore that calls for some reasonable measures to be put into place that don't, at the end of the day, affect your ability to own a gun, to use a gun, to have a gun for protection. And while we can't get to a good place on that, it is hard to understand unless you understand a bit of our political system where, as we talk about in the book, we got to do away with gerrymandering, because the reality is vast numbers of Americans would agree with the conversation you and I are having here about individual rights and, having some regulation of those rights. 80-90% of the people think that you ought to have background checks. Like 60% of the American people, close to 60% of the American people, believe you should ban the possession of AR-15s. And yet we have politicians who will do things inconsistent with the desires of their constituents and get reelected because they're in these safe, gerrymandered seats. And same thing is true with choice and women's reproductive rights. I mean, if you look at every state poll that has been done, every state has said we don't want Roe versus Wade overturned. Now, the margins are bigger in New York than they are in Texas and in Oklahoma. Don't want Roe versus Wade overturned. And yet we see some of these bills, these unbelievably extreme bills that are passed by politicians, again, inconsistent with the desires of their constituents, but they suffer no electoral consequence because of gerrymandering.
Well, yeah, it's the Stoics spoke about the virtue of temperance. Obviously, Aristotle, the golden mean, the idea of the middle ground between the two extremes. Right. I think nowhere is that captured more, the tension of that captured more perfectly than in the Second Amendment, which says both shall not be infringed and well regulated in the text, right? That's what the job of politicians are supposed to do, is to manage that tension, right? And that's what that's what we're after. And I think you're right. As a system becomes less accountable to its people, or the checks and balances or the norms fail, it gets harder to exert the necessary pressure to get to those outcomes. That's what, to me, has struck me as so strange about the Alito opinion on Roe v. Wade. Putting aside the right or wrong of abortion, his view that this is a matter better left to Congress and the states to pass law, it strikes me as, give me a good example of where we've recently passed transformative legislation on a controversial issue. Like, that capacity has diminished and diminished over the years as exactly the trends you're talking about in the book have struggled, right? As you live in a gerrymandered society, as political contributions flood the system, it becomes harder and harder for the other arms of the system to work properly. Yes, it'd be wonderful if there was a constitutional amendment that addresses a woman's right to choose or not, but I don't think that's happening anytime soon.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Alito opinion, I'm not sure how much of that language survives in the ultimate opinion, but the Alito opinion says, essentially, will this be something that the states decide? This is for the American people to decide through their legislatures. Okay. Yeah. But we're also going to allow huge amounts of dark money into that legislative and political process. We're going to, in the Shelby County case, erase, any kind of Justice Department or federal supervision that will allow the states to put in place all these anti-democracy measures, voter suppression things. Oh yeah, and we're also not going to open up the federal courts to to partisan gerrymandering claims. It's kind of like, well, wait a minute, you've crippled the political system. You've kind of put your thumb on the scale of the special interests when it comes to our political system, and that's the system to which you want to give the right to decide something as personal as a reproductive choice that a woman has. And again, I don't, there are moral, ethical, religious things about abortion that I'm not sure there's a right side, there's a wrong side. But I certainly know that because of my inability to say this is the absolute right answer, that the state should not be about taking away from, women, their consciences, their ability to decide, what they see as an appropriate moral choice. The state simply doesn't have a greater capacity to decide that than individuals who are most affected by this. And so it's interesting in this conversation. I'm talking about protecting the rights of individuals, whereas on the other side, their focus when it comes to individual rights, they're focused on the possession of guns. It's like they're kind of subject matter specific when it comes to the promotion of of individual rights.
Well, it's just a bad faith argument, right? And it goes back, putting abortion aside. This is a similar claim to that people made when Brown v. Board of Education happened, which is this isn't a matter for the courts to decide. This is a matter for the states or the communities to decide, which is to say, kick it back to the places where we have fundamentally undermined democracy, right? And so it's kind of a moving the ball. It's like, hey, go ask your mom, even though you already have the agreement with your spouse that she's going to say no. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's a way of not addressing the fundamental right or wrong issue of that decision, right? And it's frustrating. And I guess this goes to communication. How do you communicate when someone is able to not have to own? You think about some of the arguments that are made against, some of these voter rights things. It's like they're not having to own it. They argue these little side, like who would be opposed to having more identification when you register to vote? And it's like, sure, if that's actually what you cared about, or it's like I talk about this with people who are really concerned about trans women in women's sports, and it's like, but you don't actually care about women's sports. What you're arguing about a side thing, so you don't have to own the reality of your actual beliefs, which are pretty repugnant if we had to put them out there.
Right. No, I think that's absolutely right. You use trans athletes as the cover for what is really your prejudice, and so we do that in a variety of ways. We say, well, we just want to make sure that our systems, our electoral systems, are free from fraud, and so we're going to put a bunch of measures in place to ensure that they are fraud free, when there's actually little or no evidence that there's any fraud in the first place. And the impact of what it is that you're putting in place is to disproportionately disenfranchise or make more difficult to engage in the electoral process people of color, people who are urban dwellers, young people, people who are perceived to be progressives, Democrats. And so, they don't actually own the thing that they really stand for, that they are really most concerned about. In the same way that, I was going to say in the same way that segregationists didn't, own it, but actually that's maybe not true, because some segregationists did own it and said that,
it's almost more straightforward than what we're dealing with today. Yes.
And back in the day, Negroes are inferior, or something like that. I mean, some said that. Others would say, it's a matter of choice for us to decide. And, I remember seeing, Jim Clark, somebody, talking about, well, no, Negroes and whites don't want to be together. That's the reality. They don't want them. They don't want to mix. They don't want to go to school together. They don't want to eat next to one another. So it's a mix. Nowadays, I think there's not a lot of truth when it comes to the opposition to a great many things, or a lot of truth to what really serves as the foundation for a lot of these policy positions that I've been fighting against.
When it's quite eye-opening and appalling when you sort of trace the ideological roots of different positions on different issues, and how there's sort of, if I understand it, kind of a through line from uh, uh, Brown v. Board of Education into like the sort of private Christian school movement, into the abortion rights movement, into the pro-life movement. And so sometimes people think, hey, my party, and this is true of both parties, of course, but my party thinks X, my church thinks X, so I generally trust them. If you actually kind of peel back the layers of the onion and you go, well, what's the etymology of this belief? You realize it's actually kind of a laundered version of a darker, less politically correct belief, or it's a reaction to some change from a generation or two ago that has very little to do with the issue at hand.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting thing now to look at, break down what did the John Birch Society stand for?
Yeah.
Republicans, distanced themselves from John Birch beliefs back in, I guess, the 60s, 50s, whenever it was. It would be interesting to see give me all the things that the John Birch Society stood for, and compare those beliefs to where, at least some members of the Republican Party, some parts of the conservative movement, have they moved towards some, or are they now accepting of some of those beliefs? My guess would be yes. Or if they don't accept, wholesale or in a surface way that which the John Birch Society said, they have policies in place that are supportive of, John Birch ideals or John Birch beliefs. Now that's a hard thing to say, and maybe I'm being unfair, and I will admit I don't know as much about the John Birch Society, of the intricacies of the John Birch Society, but my instinct tells me that you would find a disturbing connection between where they were then and where many on the right are now.
Yeah, that's the insidious part of that dark energy, is that it gets laundered and dressed up and changed into being about, oh, I'm just concerned about political correctness, or I'm just anti-woke, or whatever. And really you've picked up a set of beliefs that are actually rooted in something that have very little to do with the thing that you're screaming about at a school board meeting.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And when you see these pictures of people who are serving as school board members, going to their cars, and people are yelling and screaming at them as they close their doors, and it's kind of like, what are we fighting about here now? I mean, you're concerned about books or critical race theory. I mean, is that really what's driving that level of ire, that level of anger? Or is it a larger set of beliefs? And I think it is that larger set of beliefs that really pushes those folks to that level, of anger.
Yeah, there was a big thing at the high school down the street from where I live, and this woman was protesting the inclusion of this book called Lawn Boy in the school library, which she believed contained all this sort of gay or homosexual themes. And the school librarian gets up and she goes, "Are you talking about this book, Lawn Boy? Because it's literally about a boy who mows lawns. You've got it confused with another book, right?" And what had happened is she had obviously just been told by someone on the internet about a different Lawn Boy book and looked at the lists of books in her school. So oftentimes people are upset, and they're really, but they don't even really realize that they have been activated and used as a pawn by somebody else.
Right. Yeah. But it's interesting too. There's a more substantive and insidious opposition to a lot of this stuff. I mean, when you think about the opposition to critical race theory, which again, terrible messaging. I mean, why are we calling it critical race theory as opposed to, wait a minute, you're against a complete and accurate history of the United States? Let's put it that way.
It sounds bad.
Yeah,
And
you know,
deliberately so. I mean, you can trace it back to like one guy who decided I'm going to label all this stuff that I don't like critical race theory and force you to defend it.
right, right. We have become, expert at avoiding dealing with some of the uglier parts of American history, and especially around race. And it's in some ways it's understandable. We have a painful history around race. The conversations are awkward or can be awkward, and rather than deal with that which is difficult, that which is awkward, we try to ignore it or to paint over it. And so that opposition to critical race theory, to a full understanding of our racial history is in a lot of ways understandable. But boy, if you want to make progress on racial issues, you're going to have to understand that history, the impact of that history on the present, if you want to get to a future that is going to be, racially better. And we have demographic changes happening in this nation, the likes of which we have not ever seen before. So unless we make peace with and understand our racial past, we're never going to get to the place where we need to be with regard to our racial future.
Yeah, what's that James Baldwin quote? Not everything that's faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. That strikes me as a good encapsulation of where we are.
Yeah, you never go against Baldwin. If he says something and you don't agree with it at first, it means you probably haven't thought well enough. You probably ought to read it a second or third time. He's a sage.
Yes, I think about his other quote. And I thought about it when I was reading your book about he's writing to his nephew, and he says, "You're a
Yeah,
descendant from sturdy peasant stock, people who
right.
built the railroads and went over the mountains and did all these things." I do try to remind myself when I get hopeless about things that we are descendants of people who did terrible things, but also by the same token, the descendants of the people who faced those terrible things and changed them and addressed them and tried to make things a little bit better. And you talk a lot about in the book about the debt that we owe those people. And I think that's an interesting way to think about it. How are you going to repay the debt that John Lewis took out in your name on Edmund Pettus Bridge?
Right. Yeah. I mean, the reality is, I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's a good read. It's a hopeful book. Um, and what I hope people will understand, and we actually talk about it in the book, is that this is. I think in some ways, it's from my perspective, it's the ultimate expression of love for my country. A belief that my country can be better, and those people who sacrificed so much, committed themselves, perhaps lost their lives, they were the ones who were the real patriots, not the ones who were in opposition to them. They fought for what this country has said it's always been about, who believed that this country could be about the things it said that defined it at the beginning, and I still think that America is possible. We are the most exceptional nation in the history of the world. I truly believe that. We're made up of immigrants. Unless you are a Native American, you're of immigrant stock.
Yeah.
I mean, you say, "Oh, I can trace my heritage back to the Mayflower." Really? Okay. Well, those were kind of religious immigrants who came here.
Yeah.
Guy, you might be as waspy as hell, but you're of immigrant stock. But the reality is, the people who leave their homelands thousands of miles away, come across oceans, whatever, they bring with them, a spirit, a capacity for challenges that make this nation great. So that's what makes this nation great: our immigrant past, and then we have to understand that as many negative things as we've done as a nation, we've done, I think, more positive things. And yeah, we should focus on those and we should acknowledge those, but we should not ignore, the negatives, because we have the capacity for greatness, the capacity for change. I believe in this country. I
Yeah.
believe in this nation.
Well, it's funny, people who sort of push back on critical race theory say, how is this going to seem to a white 6-year-old? Like when you tell me the history of the 20th century, or the civil rights movement, I don't relate to George Wallace because he's white. I relate to Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Diane Nash. Like, I relate to the people who were on the idea that we would choose to identify with the evildoers or the awful people strikes me as strange, such a strange interpretation. Like, there are plenty of heroes in American history and world history. Let people choose who they're gonna celebrate, and I think they're gonna choose the right people.
Yeah, this notion of good guys and bad guys. I think that kids are inherently good, and then they get socialized in a whole bunch of different ways.
Sure.
But if you give them choices, and I don't mean in kindergarten, you have to have a huge course on the evils and the economics of slavery. You don't have to do that, but at an appropriate time to share with young people a true history of this nation, what Black people have been forced to endure, what women have been forced to endure, and how they overcame that with allies. The civil rights movement is not just a struggle or a tale of Black victory. It's a tale of Black and white coalitions having great victories. So there's a lot of positive things that come out of a full examination of our history and the capacity of our young people. They talk about these kids as if they're like hothouse flowers, and that they can't hear this stuff, or their psyches are going to be crushed. They're going to hate themselves. No, they're not. No, they're not. They can handle a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, you look at the stuff they're looking at on the internet, and that's transforming, unfortunately, some of them, I suppose. But the vast majority of them understand, what it is that they're watching. Again, they are basically, good people wanting to be good people, and they're more likely to identify, with Diane Nash as opposed to Sheriff Jim Clark or George Wallace. Give them that choice and trust them. Have the ability to trust and to have some trust in them.
So last question as we wrap up. I was very much struck by the scene you talk about in the book. You're at your parents' house in Queens as a 12 or 13-year-old, and you're watching these events happen on television.
Yep.
And they were obviously tragic events, but they were also choreographed events at the same. Like I think about the what you witnessed and what it struck in you and how it opened you up and it changed the course of your life was in many ways exactly what leaders like Martin Luther King wanted to have happen, right? Like, he wanted that scene to happen on television, not just to bring about civil rights legislation in the near term, but to set in motion 60 years later who you are today, right? And what do you hope people who watched you on television, who have read your book or listening to this, do you ever think about where we might be in 60 years? Like, it's so easy to get wrapped up in what's happening right now, who's voting for who, that maybe we sort of underestimate the positive arc that's happening over a longer period of time.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And, I think you're right that what Dr. King was doing and those leaders in the civil rights movement was not only to fight that which they had to confront in the present, they were also planting seeds. The notion being that their generation would knock down a whole bunch of things, but that the seeds they planted, people like me, would not only enjoy the benefits of their labors, but would also plant seeds. And so that's, I think, the obligation, that I have to confront the ugly realities, the unfair realities of my time, but also to plant seeds so that there will be generations after me who will have opportunities that I have been denied. And I can't say that I've been denied an awful lot, certainly compared to my parents, but there are still inequities out there. There are still people who don't have all the benefits that every American citizen should have. And so I think what you said that's a good way to put it. That notion of choreographing things. I hope through my work, through this book, that I'm doing a bit of choreographing here as well, fighting in the present and trying to choreograph a better, more hopeful future.
No, I think planting seeds is a better way of expressing it. And I do think that's what you're doing. And so, sir, thank you very much for your work. Thank you for writing this book and for taking the time to talk with me.
All right, it's been great speaking with you. I didn't think I'd be talking about Arnold Rothstein, dark matter, and Martin Luther King. This has been a pretty interesting conversation.
I take that as a very high compliment. Thank you.
It's an ultimate compliment.